Good afternoon, everyone, and sorry for the technical delay. Um, it's my privilege to sort of be the one to start to kick this off, and I'll talk about green colonialism, um, which is a lot of these things are things that have come to me recently, and I'll just share my thoughts over my recent work, experiences, writing, and observations. So green colonialism, the new empires. Sort of, if you look at history of the world has always been about empires that are rising and falling and people trying to create new ones. The world is always in a state of flux because that's the human nature. And green colonialism is one that's recently emerged as a result of the very real climatic crisis that the world is going through now. So empires and imperialism. In practice, empires, not just this one, but all those that have existed in human history have required violence. And this one is no different, despite the fact that it's not as obvious as the old imperial wars that were fought in history. An example of some of the footprints of these empires, like protected areas, which in my view, as a scientist, are very primitive conservation tool, because when you protect geographical areas, you have to ask yourself whom they are protected from. The answer to that question very basically is that they're protected from the indigenous people, or rather the owners of the place. So it is lands protected from their rightful owners by outsiders for their own use. This is the IUCN definition of protected areas, which is still in use today. So a space recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal and other effective means. That's the key. Those are keywords there, because this is where the violation of so many human rights occurs, within that clause of other effective means. And the thing is that the current climate crisis or crisis of biodiversity loss has justified and excluded a lot of these means from the rightful examinations they should go through. So what do you have is actually law of hidden violence. So in the West, you have conservation and conservation interests representing themselves as very left-wing, liberal, peaceful, green, inclusive. You can even see the policies in many European countries where they have green parties. And this is very much what they see themselves or present themselves as, inclusive and proletarian. But in the so-called client states, I'll use this loosely. This means that the states where the conservation action happens, it's very right-wing, it's very conservative, exclusive, militarized, in uniform, it's violent, it's intrusive, oppressive, and it's often racist. The last thing I've put in red, because that's rarely spoken about. Very few people want to confront the racist nature of the conservation movement or practice around the world today. Again, imperialism through conservation practice, that now that we've established that, it requires dishonesty. Because if we were honest, we would recognize that the people living in the places where there's most biodiversity, where they have forests, where they have wildlife, where they have huge biodiversity, if there are people living there, the truth is these are actually the best conservationists. That's if we were honest. But since we are dishonest, we now create a narrative where these people or human beings are the problem. So if talking about Africa, where I come from, the African conservation narrative today is that African wildlife is in danger. And we have many endangered species, but the narrative says that the source of danger is Black people. That's why we want to create national parks. That's why conservationists do not say much about sport hunting, which is done by Westerners, but they always talk about Africans, their agricultural activities, their population, their use of environment as problems. This is an example of the dishonesty. This is a poster from the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, Kenyan-based NGO for conserving elephants. And they came up with this line that one African elephant is killed every 15 minutes by poachers. At this rate, we have about 300,000 elephants in the wild in Africa. This would be about 100,000 elephants a year. And you can see at the bottom there, they've written that at this rate, none will be left roaming wild in 2025. This is 2023. We do know that there will be elephants in Africa in 2025. We do know that for a fact. But this is accepted. You can tell lies as long as you're telling lies to protect biodiversity. You cannot tell lies about health, about business, about education, about sports, but you can tell lies about conservation because conservation has escaped that examination. Another example is what WWF does, and this was largely supported, this is a project largely supported by WWF Germany. They were seeking to save rhinos, as they say, by moving them. Now, translocation is something usually done where you have local overpopulation of animals. Rhinos are highly endangered, so we do not have overpopulation of rhinos. But this project moved a number of rhinos from some Kenya Wildlife Service managed parks into a sanctuary that was run by WWF in southeastern Kenya. And all 12 rhinos died. Some people lost their jobs, and there was a lot of negative consequences. But no one asked the reason why they were being moved. The reason why they were being moved is because rhinos and other endangered species have become very powerful power tools. They're symbols of power. The rhino it confers power to whoever controls it. So this was a transfer of power and an annexation from land from Kenya Wildlife Service, which is a state organization, to WWF. Even private individuals who are wealthy enough know that the most powerful tool to grab land in Africa today is a rhino. If you can get a rhino, you get license to fence land, few thousand acres, you get license to get firearms and shoot at people who come anywhere close to your land because you have a rhino and because rhinos are endangered. This happens also in India. There's a lot of killing of people in Kaziranga National Park, Eastern India, because of rhinos. So this is the picture from the arid north of Kenya. And this is a project run by Lewa Wildlife Conservancy. You may have heard of it. Again, translocating rhinos into a very arid area, as you can see. What happened here is that, just showing this map, this is a map of the area, and the green area is where the rhinos are. So once they put rhinos in there, that is where the permanent water, permanent grass is. Once they put rhinos in there, they fence it, and all the people around who need that grass for their livestock and need the water for their livestock can no longer access it because there's rhinos in there. So we are turning rhinos into a tool for oppression of people. And what's the root of this problem? It's the little known fact, or it's well known but not acknowledged, that imperialism and colonialism is a capitalist endeavor. Colonialism happened not because Europeans loved Africa. They didn't know Africa, but they wanted resources from Africa. They wanted resources from Asia. So these were led by the imperial, for example, Kenya, it was the Imperial British East Africa Company, which was a trading company. We had the Imperial British East India Company. These were commercial companies. So the political power followed later, but the primary aim was capitalism. And we need to keep this in mind because capitalism is what drives violence in the world today. There isn't any war in the world today that is fought without some oil resources, mineral resources, access, sea passages, etc. If you go back to the root of conflicts in the world today, you will get to capitalism or a profit motive. And this is why we have armed squads of people moving around our homelands in Africa, purportedly protecting the wildlife from us. And this is the risk we face. And I'm glad to report this gentleman recovered fully, so he's okay even now. But you have violence and inequitable agreements, resource conflicts, disenfranchised communities, loss of rights, annexation of lands and resources, fractures of cultures and societies, and militarization. If you look at conservation officers in European countries, they don't carry guns. Likewise in the United States, they may carry guns to protect themselves from wild animals, but it's not certainly not anti-personnel weapons to protect geographical areas from people. So this has led to a lot of extrajudicial killings, which is a serious problem in Kenya, as just sharing a media report. But violence is not only the guns, it's fencing as well. This is a map of Mount Kenya forest, which is currently being fenced in a project done by an NGO called Rhino Arc. If you look at the website, they say they're fencing the forest to protect the people from wildlife, to protect the farms from elephants. But if you go on the ground, this is the fence they're building. This fence cannot let even rabbits or small animals or porcupines and such go through. So we can see this is damaging to the environment. It's damaging to the ecology of different species. But scientists are on board with this because of the capitalist and profit motive behind it. Another form of violence is the imposition of birth control on societies, especially in the East African rangelands, by conservation organizations. And this is whether we talk about human population issues. Human population is an important issue, but it is to be discussed by Ministry of Health, those providing services, education, etc. Ecologists have no business discussing human populations unless they're intending to come and shoot some of those humans to get rid of them, which I know they're not. So this is something exclusive to Africa, where conservationists routinely get involved in human population issues. You do not see any conservationists talking about too many human beings in China being a danger to giant panda, or too many human beings in India being a danger to elephants or tigers. It's only in Africa. So this is where the subtle racism comes in. And so we have these agreements being signed by communities and their lands being taken by capitalists fronted by NGOs, and they're losing access to what they need for their livelihoods. And what they need for their livelihoods in a lot of Kenyan East African rangelands is land and access to land to graze their animals, because this is the most sustainable and productive livelihood that has happened in this area for thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. And ecologists and conservationists are trying to fracture it today. Imperialism requires kings and emperors. And the Green Empire is no different. One of the first emperors was Theodore Roosevelt, who first came up with the idea of national parks despite having no knowledge of ecology. And he was an unashamed racist and elitist, and interested in keeping areas for enjoyment by the elite. But we are now 120 years later, we have qualified scientists trying to follow science and actualize the dream of someone who knew nothing about science. We have princes. This is the Prince of Wales. He's one of the princes in the Green Empire. He's constantly talking about conservation in Kenya and population in Kenya, but never says anything about conservation in the UK. We have a number pictured here. These are elites and heroes: Jane Goodall, Richard Leakey, Daphne Sheldrake, Joy Adamson, Diane Fossey. These are just a number. There are many, but these are picked from the African conservation scene. I'm sure there are many from Asia and other parts of the world. But what you note about all these conservation heroes from Africa, they're all white. There's no single black conservation hero, quote unquote, from Africa. And even now, I know you struggle to name any single one. So yet Africa is where the wildlife is. So this can only mean two things. It could mean either Africans don't care about wildlife, or that conservation is racist. I know Africans care about wildlife, and I'm one of them. So I know conservation is racist. After complaining about white people for a long time, they gave us a black hero. So Netflix put up this series about a national parks, obviously narrated by Barack Obama. And when he talks about our great national parks, I was shocked to find that he's even talking about those ones in Kenya. He should be talking about Yellowstone, those ones in the United States, because there's no Kenyan who has any ownership claim over Yellowstone. I can't talk about our national parks when I'm talking about Yosemite. So we need to agree that people of different countries own their national resource, their natural resources. This is the beginning of justice and conservation. And if those of you who watch this documentary, you'll see that the national parks in the West, in the United States, the features on them all include people using them. They include local people. If you look at the segment on Tsavo National Park in Kenya, it does not include any human beings. And that is where the problem lies, where we prioritize, in Africa, we prioritize the biodiversity over its owners or stewards. So wildlife science is usually about classic conflicts. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So where you have either human beings attacking wildlife or wildlife attacking human beings, either destroying crops, property, or even endangering their lives. So this is where expertise comes in to solve these problems. But with the coming of these elites, we've gotten complex conflicts where elites are now using conservation for self-actualization purposes. This is what Roosevelt was doing. This is what John Muir was doing. This is what so many of those so-called heroes were doing. It's about fame and fortune for myself. It's not about survival of the species. So they call themselves saviors, that such that one may think the species would not exist today if it wasn't for their intervention. If you look at Edward Wilson, one as a respected ecologist, came up with a ludicrous theory called the half-Earth theory that theorized that if we conserved half the Earth for biodiversity, we could stop the loss of species and climate change, etc., etc. This is ludicrous because we do know that it would require so much injustice. But because the injustice required would be in the global south where the biodiversity is, it would be injustice against Black people in Africa, brown people in Asia, etc. So it got accepted. And this is actually celebrated like it's a good thing. So the UN took this up, but not 50%. They took it down to 30%, dialed it down a bit. But now we have this prescription for violence actually being fronted and promoted by the UN. And behind it is capitalists and their enjoyment. Kenya is currently a favorite of wealthy capitalists from all over the world. Richard Branson has a so-called conservancy and tourism facility in Kenya, as does Jochen Zeitz, another capitalist from Germany. And they all have NGOs or arms that hide their ownership of these programs. We have Hans-Jörg Wyss, who is, again, giving 1 billion to so-called to help protect 30% of the planet by 2030. And this has been channeled to the Nature Conservancy, again, targeted at Africa. So we have capitalists putting their money and a lot of money into the oppression of Africans in the name of conservation. And this needs to be called out and it needs to be questioned because no one asked where the people are going to go. This is basically how it works. The green square is community, so-called community-led conservation, conservancies, etc. This is what is shown to the West. Like it's this wonderful thing led by communities, like the Maasai people, Luo people, whoever in Africa have decided we want to conserve. We have been bad all these years, now we want to be good and conserve. What this feeds into is the brokers, which I call the bingos, the big international NGOs, Nature Conservancy, the Africa Wildlife Foundation, Conservation International, World Resources Institute, etc. Celebrities, conservation heroes also get, and these are the people who get the money from this. They're the brokers of this feel-good approach to conservation. So at the end of the day, who do they work for? Because all these community-led conservation are led by NGOs. They're not led by communities. These NGOs in terms work for corporations and capitalism, including Netflix, Meta, Shell, Total, Virgin Group, Credit Suisse, wealthy individual, Bezos, Branson, Zeitz, Lebedev, this and the others. You can name many others. Because these are capitalists are the source of our problems, but this gives them an opportunity to cleanse their names, and they will pay good money for that opportunity. At the end, what do the community get who live with the wildlife? They get the rubbish. They get smiles. People say, you're wonderful. We love you. We talk about them, we show them on documentaries, and we get a few coins from tourism. No community has ever gotten wealthy from tourism. Tourism is a dependency on outsiders. The money people make from raising livestock and raising livestock on their land sustainably, as they've done for years, cannot be compared with what they get from tourism. What they get from tourism is nothing. So the people who earn from tourism are investors like Branson, who already have a lot of money. So this is basically a big con game that goes on around the world. And this is the source of violence to protect this capitalism. So no one asks these key questions. Will all countries commit to the scheme? I was just visiting the US. You don't see any plans to increase the size of Central Park in Manhattan by 30%. It's Mount Kenya Park near where I live. Whose landscape is it? Whose seascape? Where will these people go? We have conservation refugees. We already have some. Who owns the conserved areas, and what about their livelihoods? And as we call out these schemes, new ones keep coming up. These include carbon credits, carbon trade, carbon offsets. Now they start calling nature-based solutions carbon neutral. Carbon neutrality is a myth. The laws of thermodynamics dictate that even as I'm speaking now, I'm emitting carbon dioxide. There's no such thing as carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality is just defined by some payment of money, which doesn't change emissions. And biodiversity offsets. None of this changes emissions, which are the source of our climate crisis. Now, if you look at the carbon credits, just a quick look at this map. Top 20 carbon polluters, you see China there, India, Europe, United States, or rather North America. They're the top polluters. If you look at where the carbon credit schemes are, it's almost skewed. Suddenly everything is in the south. There's only one or two carbon schemes in the whole of the United States. I think we have more of them in Kenya than the whole of the United States or the whole of North America. What's going on here is that the only place where carbon schemes are in the same place as the polluters is Asia. The rest of it is polluters in the north and schemes in the south. And this is the definition of the Green Empire, roughly placed. This is the oppression that happens. A polluter in the United States pollutes and pays millions of dollars to people to come and violently oppress people in Africa in the name of carbon offsets. Meanwhile, people in Africa lose their land and the land is gained by capitalists. It's a very simple scheme and very visible if one looks at the picture globally. We have other things like cryptocurrencies, what I call the fictitious economy. We have hydropower dams in Virunga Park in the Congo generating power to mine Bitcoin. That does not help the gorillas or the forest. This is making somebody rich, but he calls himself a conservationist. This is Emmanuel de Merode, the director of Virunga Park and the brains behind this scheme. Now let's look at the world. The world consumption of the world's resources. If we all consumed at the rate of the United States, we'd need 5 Earths to keep up with our consumption. And UK, China, India, and come back down to Niger, typical African country. So we have this colonialism is defined by people in the United States telling people in Africa what to do about environment when they are consuming more than fivefold what the people in Africa are consuming. So we need to manage our consumption and stop oppressing other countries in the name of saving the environment. Oppression will not save the environment, just cause violence. Media and literature has it as well. You see game meat and venison when it's eaten by white people, bushmeat when it's eaten by black people, hunting by white people, poaching by black people, exploring by white people, encroaching by black people, ranchers, white, herders, black, travelers, white, nomads, black, people, white, communities, black. You don't acknowledge the individual. So we commonly call this habitat encroachment when we have a livestock keeper amongst wildlife, but we call this a riding safari when you have some white people riding horses among wildlife. Academia is very important here. We need to escape from ecofascism, which is basically the driver of the Green Empire, needs to develop new standards and definitions for terms like conservation, nationally protected areas, etc. We have to entrench indigenous livelihoods and aspirations in the conservation discourse, otherwise it's useless. We have to partner with the humanities. Scientists seem to think they don't need to talk to historians and geographers and literature writers, etc., and artists. This is not the case. Tourism should be removed from the conservation discourse. Tourism is a byproduct, should just be a side beneficiary of conservation. Conservation is for our lives and our health and our welfare. Human population discussions, I said earlier on, should be removed from conservation discourse. Those should be in the health and services discourse. Renewables are also a problem when you come to Africa because you have renewable energy, but all these schemes, unfortunately, it's not very visible, but this wind farm is fenced. So people can access the land and the wind farm, the turbines for grazing, etc. We have electric cars, which we all admire very much, but we don't talk much about the coltan mines in Congo where children are abused and beaten to mine coltan for the electric cars. And there's no clean coltan to talk about. 98% of it comes from Congo. So we have to think about these things, the human environment as well. If you look at in academia, this was a study recently published in Nature about the average number of trees per person. And you look at this, and they came up with this graphic. At the top is Canada. The first African country is Ethiopia at number 6. India is way back down there. But if you look at the number 1, 2, and 3, and 4, these are settler colonies. They're settler colonies, and what this graphic shows is that white people conserve the environment and black people don't. Otherwise, they would have Democratic Republic of Congo here, and it would be number 1. Or they'd have Gabon, it would be number 1. Why don't they have Brazil or Peru? Those Amazon states. Why don't they have Borneo, Southeast Asia? This is the subtle racism that comes out even in academia as we write about environment. And this is why it's important to look at literature and look at history and look at the humanities as we study this. This is a snapshot. They recently had the Earthshot Awards. And this shows sort of what the picture is. We had the cyclists who are generating power to power this concert. They're nowhere in the photo. Those are us. Those are the black people in Africa, the people actually taking care of the environment. Then you had Coldplay on stage. They got all the praise. Those are the NGOs. They're the beneficiaries of the recognition out of the stewardship of environment in the global south. Then you have Prince William. He represents Prince William. They're the elites who claim to care about the world, yet have a huge carbon footprint. We must protect species, systems, and livelihoods, not geographical areas. That's primitive. If climate changes, if the world gets too hot, national parks will not be cool. If the quality of oxygen goes down, national parks will not have clean air. So we have to protect it holistically. These are just share some photos of Africans interacting with wildlife that National Geographic will never show you because we are supposed to be bad people. You don't see this in documentaries because Black people are supposed to be a danger to wildlife. And we don't know how to live with wildlife before the saviors came. That's in Nigeria. Previous one was Burkina Faso. First one was Kenya. This is Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. This is a town called Talek in southern Kenya. This is Laikipia, northern Kenya. This is Naivasha, southern Kenya. And this is a village called Kazinga in Uganda. It's buffaloes, elephants, and people doing their thing around there. And this is not 100 years ago. This is last year, taken by a friend of mine called Paul Curie. So this stuff exists. We know how to live with our wildlife. We don't need to be saved, and they don't need to be saved from us. I think it's time that the world each took care of the environment in our own context, rather than use this crisis to drive imperialism. Thank you for your attention.